And we're so delighted to have you back at the helm of USDA. We really appreciate your leadership, and I have to say that we are very, very appreciative of your accessibility for the media, especially for smaller outlets like ours. It's very, very important, and I just want to thank you up front for that.
Well, you folks do a tremendous service to rural America, in particular to the farm community. You are an outlet that provides information, which is incredibly important. And let me just give you one example. We're trying to get on the other side of this virus, so we all can be free from our basements and our living rooms and our Zoom calls. But 55% of Americans today are accepting of the vaccination. In other words, about 55% of us say, "Yeah, no problem. Give me a shot. I'm ready to go." That means 45% aren't, and the vast majority of the 45% are in three categories: people who live in rural America, African Americans and other minorities, and the young people. And you obviously have an outlet to a significant number of Americans today. And until we can convince our folks in rural places that this vaccination is important for the country and for the economy and for us getting back to whatever the new normal is going to be, just incredibly important. That's why I've been reaching out to farm groups and farm leaders to encourage them to talk to their members about the importance of this. There may be a number of reasons why people are concerned about this, but at the end of the day, if we don't get a majority of us vaccinated, it's just going to continue to cripple our efforts in a lot of different areas. So the outlets like yours are just incredibly important.
Well, thank you for that. We will certainly remember to keep doing our part in that regard. So I know we've got about 30 minutes here. We've got a lot of questions for you. One of the things we wanted to start with is regarding CFAP. The payments that have been going out to farmers and farm operations and ranches around the country. We're doing an analysis of where the payments have been going, and you'll see that tomorrow's newsletter. Phil's been leading that effort. But one of the things that is really very clear from that analysis that we're working on is just the magnitude of the dollars that we have been trying to help producers during this difficult time of the pandemic. But at some point, we also know those are going to go away, or at least be changed and downsized, maybe right-sized, whatever the term may be. At what point do you and your messaging start to tell people that we are going to go to maybe back to a market-oriented farm policy, or is that going to be part of the message going forward?
Well, I would say that if there's one word to describe what we need to do at USDA, it's markets. I think it's important for us to have more markets for farmers, ranchers, and producers. We have to have better markets. We have to have new markets, and we have to have fairer markets. And I think the job of USDA is to basically advance and progress in all four of those areas. And I think there's a terrific opportunity in all four. I think there is a chance for us to have better markets from a standpoint of openness and greater transparency, and potentially creating processing competition, if you will, that creates new opportunities, local and regional food systems. I think there's a chance for us to have new markets by utilizing the opportunity to sequester carbon, to conversion of agricultural waste into a variety of other products, creates new revenue streams for farmers. I think USDA can play a role in that. I think it's fair to say that we need to continue to deepen our export efforts. I think we've learned the importance of exports, the significance of it. And I think that fair markets really involves a real focus on equity. And you mentioned CFAP, and I think it's kind of starts there. I mean, the reality is, and I don't know what Philip's evaluation is going to show, but our evaluation has indicated that right now there was a significant amount of benefit to a relatively small number of producers, a large benefit to a relatively small percentage of producers. Some producers were left out completely. Some producers were obviously received very, very little. Some areas of the supply chain were not helped that need help. That's why it's important, I think, for us on the third tranche, the third go around here, to really be careful about evaluating what has taken place, figuring out what needs to take place with the additional resources that Congress has made available, and making sure that at the end of all of this, we've done the very best job at USDA of trying to provide as much help to as many people who are in need as possible. And then hopefully explain to folks as commodity prices have improved, as we do a better job of creating these markets, that we want to transition, because I think every farmer I've ever talked to would much prefer to get the check from the market and not from the government. And I think that's the goal. And hopefully this year we'll take steps towards that goal.
So you mentioned this third tranche of CFAP. I believe CFAP AA is the new acronym that's been used for it. As I'm sure you know, Congress was much more prescriptive this go round in terms of how it wrote the legislation. Specifically the $20 per acre language that Congress included in that. So you've mentioned wanting to do a review of some of the previous iterations of CFAP. How do you balance, that review and honoring the results of that review while also honoring the intent of Congress in the legislation that was passed in December?
Well, Congress also identified a number of entities that they felt had not received adequate attention during the course of the previous two tranches of resources. So it's basically taking a look at the discretionary money that was transferred into the Secretary's office under the first two tranches. There's roughly, I think, $3 or $4 billion of that resource left to distribute. Then there's the $10 billion or so from the CFAP AA that needs to be allocated. And the question is, how do you do that? And to the extent that you're helping people that have not been helped before, can you fit it into the existing program structure, or are you required to establish a slightly different structure for those resources, in which case you have to go through the administrative process of rulemaking. So it's going to take time. And that's the one thing we're trying to impress upon folks. It's not that we're trying to make it harder for people, where it's not as if we are purposely delaying. We want to take our time in evaluating how the resources have been allocated, what direction we've received from Congress, how do we benefit all of the entities that they've named in the legislation, and how do we also supplement or complement those resources with other resources that have not yet been expended at the department from regular programs that could provide help and assistance. I'll give you an example. I think Congress mentioned the fact that, and several members of Congress have mentioned the fact that the biofuel industry has not necessarily been helped during the course of this period, and they've obviously suffered significant losses, especially with the waivers. So the question is, what can be done about that industry? Well, there was an infrastructure program that was announced in the previous administration. It was relatively restrictively structured. Is there a way in which you could loosen that program up a little bit to free up the resources that are currently unspent in that program, which would obviously provide some help and assistance to the industry? So it's a combination of all those steps that have to be taken in order for us. And then, I don't know, the American Rescue Plan also contains, at least as it relates to socially disadvantaged producers, also contains additional potential assistance, which would be incredibly helpful. And so I think it's really important that we get that done and get it done quickly so that we can put that into the mix as well.
Mr. Secretary, thanks again for being here. I wanted to come back to these issues of equity and fairness again. This is something that you wrestled with quite a bit during under President Obama, so you're very familiar with the challenges. And I wanted to ask you, how would you define equity, especially when it comes to race and ethnicity? What kind of outcome would you consider to meet that standard? And do you support Senator Booker's plan? Do you think this is going to be necessary to actually acquire land and then make it available to Black farmers?
Well, this is I wish I could show you the cartoon that was provided to me a couple of weeks ago on this issue of equity. If you can envision three African Americans, an older African American, a middle-aged African American, and a child. And imagine a baseball field, and they're in left field behind the fence, peering over the fence, trying to see the game. And obviously, the older African American, taller, doesn't need much help to see over the fence. The middle-aged African American needs a little help. and the younger African American needs a lot of help. So there's boxes that they're standing on, and the boxes are all of different sizes. And to me, that's essentially the issue of equity. It's the size of the box that you have to stand on. Some folks don't have to have much help. Some folks don't have any help. Some folks have to have a lot of help. And what we've dealt with in the past, I think, was trying to respond to specific actions of discrimination. I think of the Pigford case, where individuals came in and said, here is my individual circumstance. And for that, they were compensated. But what we didn't necessarily compensate them for, nor for the population at large, is the cumulative effect of discrimination over a long period of time. If you don't get a loan, or you get a loan late, or you get a loan with a higher interest rate, that compromises your ability in the future to be able to have the resources to buy the farm that's next to you when it comes up for sale. And it ends up being purchased by someone else. Their farm gets larger. Your farm continues to stay the same size. You're at a competitive disadvantage in the marketplace. So as we look at this issue of equity, how do we basically lift these folks on the right size box so they can look over the fence? And I think the American Rescue Plan begins that process. Debt relief, obviously, very important. But unless you have access to land, and unless you have access to markets, and unless you have access to the technical information that allows you to participate in fully and completely the government programs, you're never going to get the box big enough to look over the fence. So our challenge, I think, is to look for creative ways to address all four of those issues: debt relief, land access, technical assistance access, and markets. And I think the resources available in the American Rescue Plan give us a opportunity to sort of put that system in motion to see what works and what doesn't work. I don't know that we all have the answers. I don't know that we know precisely how this is going to work. But I think there are ways in which, by providing resources to community building organizations, they can work with farmers, socially disadvantaged farmers in their area to determine how best to provide land access and to help create and expand. I think there's opportunities for us to take a look at the federal land holdings and determine whether or not any of those might be appropriately available to socially disadvantaged farmers at little or no cost, so that they can get themselves on a box that allows them to look over the fence. And in doing so, we bring everybody up. We don't necessarily disadvantage anybody. And we respond to the fact that there has been a cumulative effect of inequality and discrimination over the course of years. And the second aspect of this, after you've done all of this, is to make sure that you are keeping track of what you're doing, of having regular reporting to the secretary, so that I or any future secretary is in a position to say we're either doing the right amount, we're not doing enough. We've gotten to that place where people are all standing on the box and everybody's looking over the fence. I don't think it's going to get done in a single administration. I think it's going to take a while, but I think we're on the right road. Senator Booker has proposed a number of things in his Justice for Black Farmers Act, some of which we will begin implementing immediately. He has asked for oversight, an ombudsman, a process where we can hold ourselves accountable. I have no problem with that, and we will obviously do that. We just announced a senior advisor in the Secretary's office who's going to help us on these issues. And I think with the American Rescue Act, we can begin addressing the issue of land access and figuring out what works and what doesn't work. And then we may take an opportunity to visit with the senator and other senators who are interested in this to say, this is what we're doing, this is what's working, we need to do more of it, or this isn't working, we need to do something different.
Mr. Secretary, that's a great segue to our next question, which deals with the structure of the department. Obviously, you have some different high priorities than the last time that you served as secretary, and you just mentioned a couple of new positions that you brought in. Have you thought about just as a whole, whether or not between what was required in the Farm Bill and what you have as a desire to elevate your priorities, how you might structure the department differently in terms of either undersecretaries or direct reports?
Well, Sarah, there's a real issue here. I said at the time I was asked to take this job that it's a different department and it's a different time and I'm a different person. And I will tell you, it is definitely a different department. During the course of the last 4 years, the General Accounting Office came in and basically suggested that the way in which we had previously funded some of those positions in the Secretary's office was not authorized under statute, and that basically required a significant reduction. I think between the time I left and now, basically the Secretary's office is about half the size of what it was. And that forced the previous administration to make some very difficult choices, particularly when its budget wasn't necessarily increased. And so in some cases, they had to choose between an undersecretary and a deputy undersecretary. So many of the mission areas had an undersecretary, but they had no deputy. So we're in the process now of taking a look at that structure and trying to determine whether or not it is adequate to meet the challenges that we have on climate, on COVID, on equity, on farm income, on nutrition, et cetera. And I think we're likely to find that we're going to have to ask Congress to assist us in providing the resources to rebuild, if you will, the department. There are a number of vacancies that have not been filled, that need to be filled. One example is in the science area. The National Institute of Food and Agriculture and the Economic Research Service, between the two of them, I think it's roughly 200 to 250, maybe as high as 300 vacancies. Now, what does that mean? It means that the grant programs and the research that gets funded, but NIFTA isn't getting funded necessarily as comprehensively as it needs to be. And this is not a criticism of the previous administration. This is just reality. ERS, a lot of what you all do and report depends in part on what ERS does in calculating and providing and accumulating data. If you are short 150 or so people, the reality is the work isn't going to get done in quite the same way as it was done before. And does that compromise or impact or affect the reliance of that information? So it's just really important for us to begin rebuilding the muscle, if you will, of the department. And that's going to require resources. And that's one of the reasons why the American Rescue Plan contains an appropriation, suggests appropriation of about $47 million to begin that process. And of course, we'll be submitting a fiscal year 22 budget to Congress in the near term. And I would anticipate and expect that we'll be asking for an increase to the USDA's budget. It's pretty much where it was when I left, pretty much where it was when I first became secretary a number of years ago. So there's a lot of work to be done in that area.
So just a quick follow-up on that. Do you anticipate that you will be able then to fulfill the position to have an undersecretary for rural development again? And secondly, on ERS and NIFA, a lot of expectation that perhaps there will be, again, a move back to DC from Kansas City.
Well, we're going to have a town hall on Thursday to begin a process of listening to the employees at USDA to find out what's on their mind and find out how they feel about things. And part of the group that we definitely want to listen to are the folks at NIFA and ERS. Obviously, there was a disruption when the move took place. A lot of people's lives were obviously changed, understandably. And I think the worst thing we could do would be to create additional disruption at this point in time. I think we have to listen and learn. And then I think we have to look at creative ways to fill those vacancies and to do it in a way that's least disruptive to folks. As far as rural development is concerned, look, it is a significant priority of this administration to invest in rural places. There are significant infrastructure needs, broadband, healthcare, to name two. Housing issues remain a challenge in business development. I think if you combine it with what we would like to be able to do as agriculture moves to a net zero future, manufacturing, bio-based manufacturing is going to become incredibly important. So rural development has important responsibilities. We need an undersecretary in that position, and we need it. We need it just in the same way we need an undersecretary of trade and an undersecretary of marketing and regulatory, because it's all about markets. At the end of the day, it's about creating market opportunities and jobs in rural places.
Secretary, I'd like to pivot to climate policy for a minute. You've said that you're still in the process of evaluating the idea of a carbon bank and using CCC for that purpose. We've also talked about, and it was obviously in President Biden's campaign plan too, to use the conservation programs to help farmers implement practices, get the equipment that they need, and so forth. That's going to take a lot more money. And that's either going to come out of existing programs or Congress is going to have to put more money into it. Are you prepared to go to Congress and ask them for substantial new resources to put into conservation programs and that will build up the farm bill baseline in the process? And do you expect to do that through a climate bill or infrastructure bill that Congress is to be considering? What's ahead there?
I'd like to be able to answer that question with a simple yes, and then have you figure out what I'm saying yes to, Philip. That was quite a question. Let me see if I can break it down. Let me start with the carbon bank. The first thing we have to do in terms of looking at that as an opportunity is to determine why isn't it working today? Because clearly there is a need for sequestering carbon, and clearly farmers, ranchers, and producers have the capacity to do an amazing job in that space, and some farmers already are. Why isn't that happening in greater amounts? I think it's a number of things. One, there are about 138 million carbon credits that are currently outstanding from a variety of markets, but only about 2.5 million of them are dedicated to agriculture. So it's at this point in time for relatively small scale. The transaction costs associated with privately operated carbon markets is pretty high. There's a lot of verification, a lot of reporting. There's a lot of hassle connected to it. And there's some confusion because depending upon which market you want to participate in, there may be slightly different standards or requirements. So there's no standardization of the approach. And at the end of the day, farmers have calculated that in terms of the hassle, the size, the confusion, there isn't as much benefit to them as there is to investors or others who benefit from the market. So there hasn't just been much participation. So if we establish a carbon bank, we need to address those challenges. We need to have appropriate scale. We need to make sure that there's clarity about precisely what you need to do to be able to qualify. We need transaction costs that are reasonable. And at the end of the day, we need to make sure that we make the case to the farmer that this is for your benefit. It is not for the benefit of investors or for entities or anybody else. Can that be done? I think it can. Is CCC an opportunity to potentially begin that process? I think so. But I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in order to make sure that it's structured right, explained right, and with a sufficient resource to get it started so that we can see how it works and see if we can get farmers to participate. And if we can, then I think there is a role for the USDA and Congress to talk about the size and scale over time. But work to be done in that area. In the meantime, as we're sort of doing that work, there are existing programs that can be used and can be targeted and can be directed in creative ways to support climate smart agriculture, regenerative practices. And to the extent that we have those resources, we need to use them in that way. And to the extent that we can convince Congress that there's a need for additional resources, we should be prepared to make that case. We don't want the resources to outpace the capacity of our personnel to handle the resources. It's not just about money, it's about people. And I've heard from a number of folks in the last 2 weeks of concerns about staffing in NRCS, FSA offices, and of course, COVID has complicated things. So you want to make sure that you have the right mix of resources and personnel to be able to administer the money effectively and efficiently. So I think you're going to see aggressive action in those areas. And I think the president's vision of a zero emission agriculture is the right one, not just for the environment, but because the market, both domestically and internationally, is going to and is demanding more and more evidence of sustainability. And if the U.S. can be the first agriculture to get to net zero, we'll have a marketing advantage. And we'll certainly, I think, be able to open up new market opportunities around the world. So this is something I'm obviously very interested in, and I think it gets into that space of new markets and better markets and more markets and fairer markets.
You've also got some potential fairness issues with carbon markets. I've heard repeatedly from some folks concerned about that are saying that it's actually going to be the best capitalized, largest farmers that own their own land who are going to benefit the most. Both they're going to be able to participate more easily, and the carbon credits are going to be built into the value of their land, increase the value of their land. Farmers in drier areas where cover crops don't work as well are going to be disadvantaged. How are you going to address those concerns?
Well, I think we're going to have to do some serious thinking about all of that, and that's why you want to start. You don't want to start like with a very, very large program. I think you want to start with a reasonably sized effort to make it real and to basically learn. We're not going to have all the answers at the outset. We're going to learn as we go along. I would say that I think there are opportunities throughout agriculture, whether it's renewable energy on the farm, or whether it's methane capture and reuse, or whether it's cover crops, or rotational grazing, or crop diversity, or can we create, for example, in those areas where where there's livestock being raised, can we help promote the technologies that would allow for capture and reuse of methane? Can we essentially continue to do research on feed additives that will reduce methane? And can there be some kind of compensation for the use of that kind of feed additive? Are there ways in which research can develop better root systems that will sequester more carbon? And is there a way of providing premiums? I mean, there's a whole way of being creative about this and to reflect the complexity and the diversity of agriculture. And I think we want to create a system as best we can that helps folks, regardless of size, be able to have that additional revenue stream. In addition to that, I think we also have to look at ways in which we can create markets that allow those smaller and mid-sized producers to negotiate their own price, and that gets you into local and regional food systems that can be supported through USDA. And I think it's also fair to say that if we can expand processing facilities and create more regional processing facilities, not having to depend on just very, very large processing facilities, we can make the food supply system not only fairer and more competitive, but also more resilient. So I think and also shorten the greenhouse gas footprint of the food that ultimately gets processed and gets to the market and gets on your plate. So I think there are a multitude of ways that we need to be working in order to create as much opportunity for additional income for farmers. And here's why I've been saying this recently, and you've probably heard me say it. I think it is startling that 90%, 89.6% of farmers in this country today do not make the majority of their money from farming. Now, I asked our team, can you think of another occupation or profession where 90% of the people participating in that profession or occupation don't make the majority of their money from what they do for a living? And somebody said, well, Jason, Hoffmeister said, well, YouTube gamers. Well, okay, that's another group, right? But I mean, seriously, think about this. How can we say that our system is working as well as it should when nearly 90% of the folks in that system have to work another job, or their spouse has to work a job in order for them to get the majority of their money to make a living? I mean, I think we have to recognize we've got more work to be done to do here, and it's in all areas. It's deeper markets, it's more markets, it's fairer markets, it's better markets, and we just can't depend on the same old of encouraging exports and having farm programs. All of that's important, but if we continue to just have that structure, we're going to continue to have 90% of the people in this business not make a majority of the money from what they do. And that just doesn't seem right to me. And I can't imagine it seems right to anybody.
Mr. Secretary, one last question before we let you go. And again, certainly appreciate the time that you offered up to us here today. Wondering if you can reflect back on us or on your previous tenure and in sort of this intervening period between it, specifically in the area of some of these civil rights concerns that were raised. As I'm sure you're cognizant, there were some civil rights concerns raised, shortly after your announcement in regards to how some of that was handled in your previous tenure in office. I'm wondering in the last 4 years, as you kind of reflected on the 8 years you spent as secretary, in particular, these last 4 months since we saw, President Biden get elected and you get named, what were you able to kind of gain from your own personal reflections on your previous tenure, and how has that changed your upcoming tenure?
Well, in 2009, when I first became secretary, Secretary Glickman and Secretary Veneman came into my office, and I expected them to tell me that I needed to focus on farm programs or conservation programs or food for peace and international food programs. And they sat down. I can never forget this. They sat down on the couch in the office, and they basically said, "You've got a civil rights problem at USDA." And I had no idea what they were talking about. And it turned out that they were right. We had, I think conservatively, at least 20,000, probably more than that, 20 to 25,000 individual claims of discrimination that had been assessed against the department by a variety of groups, Blacks, Hispanic, women, Native Americans. And so the focus in 2009 was on trying to resolve those claims, which had been unresolved for a period of 10, 15, 20 years. Congress had appropriated additional money in the Farm Bill of 2014, 13, whenever it was, of $100 million to resolve the Black farmer claims. We determined that that wasn't sufficient, and I went to the president in the Oval Office, my first visit with him, private visit with him, and I said, "Mr. President, we need more resource. We need your help in working with the Justice Department and Congress to get $1 billion more in that resource." And he certainly agreed, and we got the money, and then we structured a settlement in Keepsigal, which was the Native American case, and then and women farmers case, and then the Hispanic issue wasn't a class action, so we had to create a structure for individual claims to be resolved, which we did, and we got resources to do that. So the focus in 2009 was on those individual acts of discrimination. We also took action within the department to try to reduce the future number of discrimination claims by a variety of issues. I got regular reports, and we saw a significant decline in the number of complaints, both at FSA and rural development. We had the county committees didn't have minority representation. I utilized the power of the Secretary's office to basically put minority representatives on those county commission appeal boards so that we had a diversity in the room when they were making decisions. So we took a series of specific steps to respond to specific issues that were at top of mind. And at the end of 8 years, I think we had done some good work. We didn't necessarily address in those 8 years, because it wasn't top of mind, the systemic nature of actions at the department, and for that matter in the federal government, that made it more difficult for Black farmers and other farmers to feel like they were getting a fair shake at USDA. So in the interim, and as I began preparing for this next stint, it became obvious that in the top of mind wasn't individual acts of discrimination. It was this cumulative impact and effect of discrimination that needed to be addressed. So we're prepared to do that. We're prepared to have an equity commission that will dive deep into our programs to figure out where are the problems, where are the barriers, what do we need to do to correct that situation. Obviously the resources that the American Rescue Plan will provide, if passed, will certainly provide an opportunity for us to take a significant step forward. We'll take a look at what we need to do in those county committees and state committees to make sure that there's adequate diversity. We'll certainly have a diverse workforce. We've already, I think, reflected that in the selections that that have been named to this point. And we'll have a greater accountability, not just with the Equity Commission, but on a day-to-day basis. So I think we'll take the steps to address what's top of mind now, which is the systemic nature of all of this as opposed to the individual acts. And hopefully we will begin a journey that will not be completed in 4 years, but will certainly allow us to go further down the road towards a USDA and programs that are available to everyone, because it's in USDA's best interest. It's in the country's best interest for us to do that.